fantasy, superheroes, and so on is that we know people buy them. But of course, you should be aware that people do get tired of genres if they're overexposed. So personally, I would probably not make a superhero story right now. Because at least in the West, with Marvel, there has been so many superhero stories, and they have been such a big part of everyday life for 10 more years. People are just tired of them, and they've stopped watching them. So you can see that in the ticket sales. So I'm sure in the East, there are similar genres that get overloaded in time. I would probably stay away from those. But if a genre has not been up for a while and you have a fresh spin on it, then I think you should go for it. But like I said, it's not enough that you know how the genre works. You need to know that. You also have to bring it something new, because otherwise there's nothing to own. You can only own what is unique, right? And you need to stand out. So yeah, I think that's my advice on that.
Okay, thank you so much for your advice. And I think we will choose the genre that we have passion and on the strength on it. Now, Jen, do you have any suggestion? Not a superhero story, but what is your suggestion? If you are,
I'm sorry.
Like, do you have
What's the
any? Do you have any suggestion on game genre? Like you said, if you are, if your advice, if you were a game developer, you wouldn't choose the superhero story, right? So,
Right.
which story would you choose if you?
I don't know. That's too broad a question for. Well, I understand you asking, but I think you have a 3 to 5 year development process in making a game. Anything that's really successful right now, you cannot be sure it's going to be really successful in 5 years, right? Maybe there will have been too many of them by then. So maybe don't make what's the biggest thing in the world right now, because 5 years from now it may not work. On the other hand, you have the challenge that if something is really hot right now, that's where the investors want to put their money. So you're in a bit of a jam there. So I think you can think yourself to death on this and get nowhere. I think you should probably go with something that you really want to make and that you can prove to an investor that there's a market for it. And if it's an art project, then of course you're not really making genre. Then you're making something completely original. So that's not a type of story, that's a new kind of story. So that's different. Art is different. But if you're trying to build a commercial success, I would say make what you can get money for and make what you can be passionate about for 5 years. Because, it's a long time to spend in one kind of story.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you so much for your advice. And for the next question, they ask about do you see any opportunities in Vietnamese game market and how the developers in Vietnam can leverage the opportunities to compete on global?
Yeah, I see a lot of potential. I think the trick is that when you're making a universe, a fantasy universe or science fiction universe or a detective or whatever kind of universe you're making, it has to feel authentic, right? Even though it's a fantasy or even though it's in the future, it has to feel like it could be real. And the secret to doing that is to anchor it in a real culture. So you're not just inventing everything, because it's just going to be strange. But if you anchor it in a real culture and then maybe twist it a little, then it feels real, but it also feels new. So my advice would be anchor it in Vietnamese culture, because to you, it may be, you know it really well. You think it's a little bit boring. You've heard of this ever since you were little. But to me, in Denmark, it's super exotic, and I don't know any of the things you know about Vietnam. And you have a very specific aesthetic, you have a super interesting history, you have a whole philosophy and religion. If I was making a science fiction game in Vietnam, I would anchor it in Vietnamese culture. And I would do the same with fantasy or detective or whatever. But there's one more trick you need to do. You need to make sure that everybody in the world feels emotionally connected to it. So to me, Vietnamese culture is strange and exotic and fantastic because I don't know it. I don't see it when I look out the window. But it also has to have something that's familiar to me. And that was what I talked about with the emotional hooks, right?
Yeah.
And I think the big trick there, the real secret, if you promise not to tell anybody, I'll tell you, it's family, right? It's
Yeah.
family. Because everybody in the world has a family. And if you look at, Dune or Star Wars or Thor in Marvel, it's all about brothers and sisters and mothers and lovers and quarrels and all these things. So if you make it about Vietnamese culture and some family conflict that everybody in the world knows somebody who's had, then you're going both unique and global.
Yeah, it is really cool. Because here I got some like keywords, like you said in I don't really remember, but in the lesson number 8, you have talked about the unique and also about the really relatability, right? So I think the unique here is the control in Vietnam, and the relatability here it can be family, um, the connection in family, right? So
Yeah, or it could be, think of Harry Potter, right? If you ask me, it's about bullying in school, right? It's about every story of Harry Potter is Harry goes to school and then there are nasty bullies who come after him. And then he has to figure out who his friends are and he has to study hard and then he wins. Everybody can recognize that feeling from school. Even if you've not been bullied, you know somebody who has or so on. So it's a universal emotional hook, but it's anchored in the British school system, right? It's all about how English schools work, boarding school and the way the relationship with the teachers and eating together. And it all feels real, but it's got magic and dragons and wizards and all these things. So yeah, I think that's a great way to do it.
yes, a great advice, and I think we can like apply into a game. So I think we will move into the next question, and again ask about the key component when you are for your vision of a new IP, and how can you remain consistent throughout the development process.
Yeah. So this is something we've worked a lot with in a lot of different companies. So if you have your pens ready, I'll give you the key components. So component number 1 is you need a consistent artistic intent, right? This is the last point I made in the speech. It has to be about something and it has to be consistent throughout. Point number 2 is it needs a relatable core, right? This is the emotional hook we just talked about. It needs to have emotions that most of the people in the world can recognize. You can also do really narrow emotions that very few people will recognize, but that's hard, if you ask me, and you may get lucky and that may explode and become a bigger one. But if you're building a company, that's a big risk. So, number 3 is you need a repeatable emotional journey. Excuse me. So this means that the dark secret of franchises is that it's the same emotional journey every time, right? So every time you watch Spider-Man, you get the same emotional journey of it's his parents and it's his editor and the public doesn't like him. And oh, there's a supervillain as well. Next movie, same story. Next movie, same story. It's just a new supervillain every time. So you need a repeatable emotional journey. Number 3 is number 4 is you need a tentpole character. So you need your Lara Croft or your Batman or your James Bond or whatever, and it needs to be cool, different, and ownable in a court of law. You need to be able to protect it. If it looks like just another fantasy knight, then you can't own it because there's just too many of them out there. Number 5, you need an ongoing conflict. So the story should not end in game 1, right? Think of Star Wars. Yes, there's a satisfying ending in the first game, or first movie, sorry. But it continues. The conflict with the Empire has now gone into 9 feature films, and even more, actually. And there's a couple of TV series, and so on and so on. So you don't want a conflict that ends after the first game. And then finally, you need a unique universe built to last. So you need a world and a mood and a setting that can have many stories in it. Again, if you look at Star Wars, this is a big universe. And even though we now know some of the planet names and so on, it's never ending, but the feeling is the same every time. We want to go back there and get that feeling again. So yeah, these are the 6 components.
Yeah, so we have 6 components, and I think you already mentioned in your speech that we just like have if you can choose the 6, I think it's the most important component if you want to pick from your key lesson, right?
Yeah, the big trick though is to develop this really passionately, but also make sure that you're alone in the market, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to develop a story about wizards going to school, for example, because it's already been done. So you need to be passionate, but you also need to have your eye on the market to make sure there's a gap where you are making your world.
Oh, I think your key lesson number 8, we repeat a lot, like about the unique and relatability. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you
so
so much.
Yeah, okay.
So I think we will move into the next question because okay. So for this question, it's about how do you identify the emotional hooks that to your target audience, and how do you validate these elements during your development?
Yeah, so like I said just before, the emotional hooks are conflicts that people will recognize, right? Emotional conflicts that people will recognize. So, not many people have ridden a dragon, but a lot of people know what a bad family is. So, Game of Thrones is basically bad families and dragons, right? So you need that recognizable emotional hook, and it should be something that a lot of people have experienced or heard about. So, like I said, the father-daughter thing in Last of Us, or the father-son thing going on in God of War, very recognizable. How do you validate it? Well, my favorite way is to say the person who is responsible for the story should tell it to people as often as possible. So what I mean by that is stand up and tell the story with words. First this happens, then that happens, but then this happens, and then that happens. And you will be able to feel when people stop paying attention. You can see in their eyes that they're bored now, or they're thinking about something else. The person writing the story should be able to tell the story as well. And the first people to tell it to is the people in the team making the game, right? And that's important because not only do you get to try if the story is working, but you also get everybody on the same page. And that's super important as well. I would then broaden that out. So once you start telling the story, maybe in a short way to investors, that's a short way, that's a minute or 2 at most. Or maybe potential players, find players, people who like that type of gameplay, and tell them the story, see if they like it. Are they interested? Do they want to know more? Do they like the person you're telling the story about, the main character? And then you could actually broaden out again. You can make short documents that tell the story, and you can send it out, and you can ask for feedback. We had one client where they actually made a choose your own adventure story, just with text for the whole story. And then they sent it out to test people, and they saw how far they got before they stopped playing. And because it was pure story, right? There was no graphics. Then later they brought in the level design and the graphics and all that, but it was the same story. So you really need to get into the feeling that if you're telling a story and people stop listening, it's not a good story. It's really that simple.
Yes. So but I think it's the testing phase, but during the development, you repeat it, like you have you have to test it like again and again with a story when they develop that story, like, or just in the testing phase at the first phase when you
So
about
you're
to
talking about testing the actual game story when it's in the game.
when it's in the game and
Yeah.
during the development, like.
Yeah, well, I would start before it goes into the game, because, as I said, once it gets into the game, it becomes really expensive to change the story, because now you have cutscenes and graphics, and you make a change, 2 hours into the game, suddenly you have to change things before that and after that, because now the story is not matching up. So my biggest advice is make sure the story is really, really good before you start putting it into the game. Then once you do put it into the game, then we get to testing, right? You're doing testing on the gameplay and so on. You're getting feedback on that. You also need to get feedback on the story. So that's really about interviewing your test people. Have they noticed the story? Do they like it? Are they interested in knowing what happens next? Do they feel the kind of emotions you're hoping? If it's a horror story, they should feel frightened. Are they frightened? If it's a love story, they should want the two lovers to get together. Do they care? So, it's about asking emotional questions, where on the gameplay you're maybe asking more gameplay design questions.
Yeah, so the story we have to test and finalize it before we start develop our game, right?
Yeah, it's just really difficult to change a story once you've put it into the game.
Okay, I got it.
So try to change it before you put it into the game.
Thank you so much for your advice, and yeah, I clearly like get all the info from it. So I think there's the last question from the registration form, and they ask about can you share the techniques or frameworks you use to create characters or your IPs?
Yeah, so if you're building stories, there are a number of ways to build characters. So number one is hire a writer who understands story. Because I know the character is a visual design, but it is also a written thing, right? You also need to understand what's the character's backstory, where did he or she come from, what's their feeling about the world, what's their attitude, where were they educated, what are they interested in, what are they afraid of. All these things you need to know, and it needs to be in a dialogue with the visual design. So the visual design becomes interesting. So if you have a writer, the writer should know how to write a character. That is part of the education writers go through. Now, as I said in the talk, the tricky thing is that often the people managing the writers don't understand story. And that is a big problem, because that means the first thing the writer brings you just gets accepted, because you don't know what's good or what's bad. So I think my best advice is get a writer who knows how to build a character, get the writer and the visual designer to work together, but get somebody who also understands story to be a sparring partner for the writer. Because being alone about something is not great. You need somebody to have a dialogue with, to say, this is not quite working, this bit could be better, and that person needs to understand story as well.
So if there is a team to create the character, so there will be three main person, right? One is a writer, and one is the visual design, and one who understands the whole story.
Yes, and of
Yeah.
course the creative director should be in there as well. In a perfect world, the creative director understands story as well, but it's not always the case.
Also, so there will be four people who can like in charge in create a characters or an IPs.
Yes. And if you have very big commercial ambitions, once you have your character ready, I would bring in a lawyer to check if it's ownable globally. Because if there's another character that looks too much like it, then you can't own it in a court of law. So, for example, there's a Western game called Shovel Knight with a blue knight with a shovel. And, that's very unique. But if you make a blue knight with a shovel, then you can't own it because they already own it.
Yeah, I get it. So right after we have a like draft about the characters, we should bring it right there to make sure it's unique or not, or is it ownable?
Yeah. Or just do your own research. You can also do your own research, but it depends on how much money you have.
Yeah, I got it. So I think that's all about the questions we have received from the registration form. And if you can see here in the chat, there are 2 questions. So we will move into the live Q&A with. Can you see the question in the chat?
I can see the chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So for the first question, he asked about what is the difference between world building and story.
So, do you know Lord of the Rings in Vietnam? Is that a popular thing?
Yeah. It's popular in Vietnam.
Okay, so if we think of that, then the world building is Middle Earth, right? It's the geography and the history of the world, and of course, it's tied into the story because the history of the world is also about Sauron, who's the big enemy in the story. So, but all of that is what I would call backstory. It's what happened before the story starts. And that's really what world building is. It's everything that happened before the story starts. And then the story starts, and you have a hobbit in a village, and things start to happen. That's the story. But he's walking through the world, right? And he's discovering parts of the world building that you spent time building. And that gives it a feeling of reality. So the world champion of world building is, I think, probably Tolkien and Frank Herbert. Dune also had really great world building. But that's a matter of taste. They say that Tolkien spent 20 years building the world before he wrote The Hobbit.
Wow.
So he was developing languages and geography and alphabets and history of the gods and where did the elves come from and what happened with Sauron and where did the rings come from and what's the map, where's Gondor, where's, history of the Gondor horsemen. He spent 20 years. That was the part he loved the most. Then he wrote The Hobbit, which is a tiny story in that world he had built.
Yeah. So the world and the universe is big, and we should have it in the very first beginning, and the story, and we can develop it in that universe.
Yeah, I would say in a game, the story is what happens from the moment the player starts to play. But you have to know about what happened before, right? Where did this world come from? Where does this city come from? How did all these conflicts start? And how did that sword get there? And so on. And you go back and forth between the two because you start writing the story, you realize, oh wait, we need a sword here. Okay.
Ok. Trang ơi, chắc là mute giúp mình tiếng ha. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for your advice, and I think we will move into the next question. And he asked about what stage of development we should seek consultancy from agency like you, and if too early we don't have enough budget, or so I think because the limited resources.
The best time is pre-production. So you need the money first because that comes before pre-production. But you don't want, if you go too late, wait too late, then yes, it's too late to change. So sometimes people, the challenge we often see is that when people have the money, because they have not put the IP in the budget, even though they have the money, they can't actually afford to get advice because all the money goes to programming and level design and animation and sound and so on. And then, oh, we need help with the IP. Yes, but we don't have any more money. Okay, well, we won't do it then. So my advice is before you get the money, put the IP development into the budget. And then when you get the money, you need the help in pre-production because that's when you're developing the story and the world and all those things. And then when you go into production, you may need a little bit of sparring and so on, but then you have an IP vision and you know where you're going. So pre-production is the sweet spot.
Just you have to put it in the budget so you can do it. If you like not include in the budget, so you will not do it.
That's the thing, isn't it?
So I think we will move into the very last question because the time I think is running out. So think here I saw the last question. It has about I'm a solo developer and trying to handle many aspects about game and also the story. Do you have any advice to make the world building more immersive and the character like more like believable?
Yeah.
Can you get the idea of this question?
Well, they're big questions, but I think I can do short answers. I mean, the way you make your world more immersive is to build a good backstory, right? How did this world come to be? What makes it interesting? And then slowly uncover it as they go into the game. So this doesn't have to be big. It can just be little snippets, right? Why is this castle here? And where did this sword come from? And why is this character sad? You know, just little touches, like if you play Bloodborne, right? The little text every time you pick up a new piece of equipment, that's making the world more immersive because it's bigger. There's a reason why this sword is here, and so on. How you make the character more believable? Work with a writer. If you're doing everything yourself, find a friend who loves to write, and I would, just have fun with them to make the story because writing a story is such a different skill set from programming a game that, trying to do it alone is not impossible, but it's difficult.
So for the first point, like you should develop your world building from just not a very too big like universe or like too much big things, but all the things in your world should have a reason to be there. Is it your idea?
Yeah. Everything should have a reason for being there, yes.
And also for the second point, you should have a writer.
I strongly advise you to find a writer. Yes, it's an underestimated thing.
Okay, so I thought it's a very last question, but here I saw a question that he asked about he practicing narrative design and
yes, I think Twine is a good practice tool. Yes, this is actually the tool that one of our clients used to prototype their story. Wow. So, if you can write a Twine that people find exciting and stay with, that's a good story. The difficult thing is, of course, that if it's your friends, they may stay with it just to make you happy. So you want people to walk away as soon as they find it bored, because that's the bit you need to change, right? So I would say bring in strangers or people from your school, people you don't know, people who don't owe you anything. You know, the big question is, when are you bored? Just stop when you're bored, because that's when your story is not working. You need to change something, and change it and find somebody else. So go. Please stop when you're bored. Okay, that bit doesn't work. All right, go back and change it. Then take the next test person.
So
Stories are all about keeping people's attention. If the story does not keep people's attention, something is wrong.
And we can like have another story, or do you have any like a suggestion or another tool besides Twine to practice the narrative design? Can you suggest?
Yes, Word. just write. You know, it's text is your tool. It's about, can you write a text that keeps people's attention? But be aware that different people are interested in different things. So if you ask a romance fan to test your science fiction story, they probably will not like it. So make sure you have the right audience. If it's a science fiction story, you should bring in people who like science fiction and get them to read it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
And then verbal storytelling again, right? Tell the story with words.
Wait, sorry, and make sure it's attractive.
I'll put the answer to the last one here. This is the best story writing book that I have seen. It's called Story, and it's by Robert McKee. I think it's up here on my shelf somewhere, but I can't find it. That's the best one I've seen.
Okay. Thank you for all your advice and suggestion and all your insightful sharing today. Thank you so much for your support and contribution to VGDA. And also, I think we have come to an end of webinar 21 with the topic building lasting IPs and powerful brands, 10 key lessons. And thank you everyone so much for staying until now. And if you have any other questions or like you need any support from Leverage, can they have your email or your contact to?
Sure, it's right here. And you know, I've never been to Vietnam, so if you need a workshop, I'd love to come.
Wow, thank you so much, and hope to see you in Vietnam very soon.
I'd love that. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Have a great day, everyone. I'll see you in the next webinar hosted by VGDA. Okay.
Thank you,
cảm ơn tất cả mọi
Phương.
người.
Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you. See you. Cảm ơn tất cả mọi người đã tham dự webinar số 21 của Hiệp hội Phát triển Game Việt Nam, và chúng ta cũng sẽ kết thúc chương trình tại đây. Đối với tất cả những câu hỏi mà mọi người ban đầu chưa thể giải đáp trong chương trình ngày hôm nay, thì chúng ta có thể gửi từ chương trình, cũng như là có thể contact qua email của diễn giả đã gửi lại ở trong phần chat. Hàng tháng thì Hiệp hội cũng sẽ có các buổi chia sẻ webinar như hôm nay, thì hy vọng là mọi người cũng sẽ gặp lại mọi người trong những chương trình sắp tới. Và nếu như mà mọi người có một cái topic hay là một cái request về diễn giả thì mọi người có thể gửi về qua fanpage của Hiệp hội Phát triển Game Việt Nam. Ban tổ chức sẽ ghi nhận và có thể tổ chức những buổi webinar cho mọi người để giải đáp tất cả những cái thắc mắc trong quá trình mà khó khăn mà mọi người trong quá trình làm việc. Cảm ơn rất là mọi người, và hy vọng sẽ gặp lại mọi người ở trong những số tiếp theo. Ok, bye bye mọi người. Chúc mọi người buổi tối vui vẻ ạ.